Platform businesses, right? They're everywhere you look these days. But what makes them so dominant? Why do some become giants while others just fade away? That's what we're diving into today.
And we've got a great source to help us unpack all of this, the business of platforms.
This book really digs deep, doesn't it?
It does. It doesn't just focus on today's digital giants either. The authors take us back in time a bit, showing how the dynamics of platform businesses have been around for longer than we might think.
Oh, really? Like, what's a historical example of a platform business?
Well, believe it or not, you can even look at the telephone as an early platform.
The telephone. Now, that's a new way to think about it. Explain that one.
It's all about the way value is created. Think about it. Every time someone new got a telephone, the entire network became more valuable for everyone already connected, right? That interconnected value, that's a key characteristic of platforms.
So is that what they call network effects?
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. The more people use a platform, the more valuable it becomes for each user, like a snowball effect.
And these days, those snowballs can roll downhill pretty darn fast, huh?
You're telling me digital platforms can explode in popularity almost overnight. That speed and the potential for dominance, it's unlike anything we've seen before.
It's true. Things move so much faster in the digital age.
Right. Think about it. Building a railroad across a continent, that takes years, decades even. But a platform like Facebook, they can gain 1 million users in a day.
It's mind-boggling when you really stop and think about it. But even with those network effects, the book makes it clear that it's not the only thing that determines whether a platform will be successful or not.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to the story. Just having a lot of users doesn't guarantee long-term success. The business of platforms really dives into those nuances, which we'll get into more in a bit.
Okay, so it's not just about network effects. What else is there? What are some of those other factors that can make or break a platform?
Well, one key concept is that the platform landscape can become fragmented.
Fragmented? What does that even mean?
Good question. It means instead of having one giant platform that rules everything, things are splitting up.
Splitting up? Like how?
Well, the book talks about a couple of things. One is multi-homing. Basically, it means people are using a bunch of different platforms for the same thing instead of just relying on one.
Oh, right. Like with social media, I use like 3 different platforms, but for totally different reasons.
Exactly. You might connect with family on one, share professional stuff on another, and then there's that one you only use for, keeping up with certain interests.
And then on top of all that, you've got all these smaller platforms popping up. They're not trying to be the next Facebook or Amazon, but they're really good at serving a specific niche.
Right. Niche competition, that's another big factor. These smaller platforms can really chip away at the dominance of the bigger players, especially if they build a strong community around that niche.
It's like they're finding all the little cracks in the foundation and squeezing in. So with all that going on, it seems like it'd be almost impossible for a new platform to come along and dominate the entire landscape.
It definitely makes it a lot harder. And that leads us to another concept the book digs into, barriers to entry. The platforms that have already made it big, like Amazon, they've created a tough environment for anyone new trying to break in.
So it's like they've built a massive wall around their territory.
Pretty much. They've got the resources, the name recognition, not to mention those powerful network effects we were talking about.
So how is anyone supposed to compete with that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The good news is that the business of platforms doesn't just highlight these challenges. It also provides a kind of roadmap, or at least a set of guiding principles for building a successful platform.
Okay, now you're talking my language. Lay that roadmap on me. What are the key steps?
Well, the book outlines 4 essential steps. First up is to choose your sides.
Choose your sides. Are we talking about picking teams for dodgeball here?
Not quite. This is about figuring out who are the core groups you want to connect on your platform.
Right, because the whole point of a platform is to bring people together, but you've got to decide who those people are going to be.
Exactly. Are you connecting buyers and sellers, like on Etsy? Content creators and consumers like YouTube? Or maybe you're creating an ecosystem for app developers and users like Apple's App Store. That choice will shape every other decision you make about your platform.
That makes sense. You've got to have a clear vision from the beginning. So what's next on our platform building journey?
Once you know who you're connecting, you've got to tackle the age-old chicken or egg problem.
Ah, the classic dilemma. How do you get enough users to attract other users when you're just starting out?
It's a tough one, no doubt about it. The book shares some fascinating examples from history, but unfortunately, there's no magic bullet for solving this one.
Every platform has to figure out its own way to crack that egg. Okay, so we've chosen our sides. We've hopefully found a way to solve the chicken and egg riddle.
Yeah.
What's the next ingredient in our platform recipe?
Next up, it's time to figure out how you're actually going to make money from all of this. We're talking about designing a sustainable business model.
Okay, so it's time to talk about the money.
Hmm.
How do platforms actually turn a profit? What are we, what are we looking at here?
Well, there's no one right answer there. Different platforms find success with different models.
Right, of course.
The book talks about everything from, the classic transaction fees.
Sure, like every time someone buys something.
Exactly, to subscription services, advertising revenue, and then there are the more complex models like freemium, where
Freemium, yeah, that's everywhere these days.
it is, and it makes sense, right?
Give you some stuff for free to get you hooked then.
Then bam, they hit you with the premium features and you're like so hooked on the basic version that you're willing to pay.
It's a smart strategy if you can pull it off.
But you've got to get that balance right. The book, it actually goes into a lot of detail about how if the free stuff's too limited, well, people just aren't going to bother.
And if the premium features aren't that great, what's the point in upgrading?
Exactly. So there's a real art to it. But the main takeaway, I think, is that regardless of the specific business model you choose, you've got to have a way to make money that's actually sustainable.
Otherwise, your platform's not going to last very long.
Exactly. It's all going to come crashing down. And that brings us to that final step in the platform building process, according to the book. We've got to establish some rules, some ground rules for the ecosystem.
So we're talking about like setting the rules of the game, making sure everyone's playing fair.
That's part of it, but it goes deeper than that, I think.
Really? How so?
It's about building trust, right? Trust between the platform and the people who use it, trust between the users themselves.
Because without trust, the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. And the business of platforms, it really drives this point home with some pretty stark examples of platforms that failed because they didn't build that trust.
Oh, you mean those platform graveyards we were talking about earlier?
Precisely. Because not every platform becomes a Google or an Amazon. There are a lot of cautionary tales out there.
So what are some of the big ones? What can send a platform spiraling towards oblivion?
There are a few that the book really digs into, but one that sticks with me is the case of Sidecar.
Sidecar. They were a ride-sharing company, weren't they? I vaguely remember them, but they're not exactly a household name these days.
Exactly. And what's interesting about Sidecar is that they were actually pioneers in a lot of ways. They came up with features that Uber and Lyft ended up adopting later on.
So what happened? They were ahead of the curve, but still couldn't make it.
Well, the book talks about a few factors. Competing with Uber was brutal, for one thing.
I bet.
And Uber just had more money, more resources to throw at the problem.
So even with a great idea, you still need the resources to compete?
Unfortunately, yeah. Innovation alone isn't always enough. Another really interesting case, and one that highlights the importance of cultural differences. Have you ever heard of what happened with eBay in China?
eBay. They're huge. I mean, they're a global company. What could have gone wrong there?
It's a fascinating story, actually. The book explains how eBay, they kind of underestimated the importance of local preferences. Like they tried to just take their American model and drop it into the Chinese market without really adapting it.
Oh, wow. So what happened?
Well, for one thing, eBay relies heavily on user reviews, that whole system of ratings and reviews.
That's like their whole thing.
Right, but in China, things work a bit differently. Trust is built more on personal relationships, face-to-face interactions.
So eBay's system just didn't resonate the same way.
Exactly. They ended up getting outsmarted by a local competitor called Taobao, which really understood the importance of those personal connections, those direct interactions.
That's wild. They were so focused on what worked for them in one market that they missed those crucial cultural differences. Are there other companies that made that same mistake?
Oh, absolutely. The book actually has a whole section on how that same kind of cultural miscalculation has played out in all sorts of industries and regions.
It makes you realize how complex this all is. Okay, so we've got Sidecar, we've got eBay in China. What other platform failures should we be aware of?
Well, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Microsoft. Remember Internet Explorer?
How could I forget? It used to be the only game in town. What was it they just stopped innovating? Rested on their laurels a bit too long?
Pretty much. The book really breaks down how Microsoft, they just became complacent. Chrome came along and it was faster, more user-friendly, and they just couldn't keep up.
It's like that old saying, adapt or die.
It's the truth. And that need for constant innovation, it's especially true in the platform world. But even when platforms do manage to become dominant, new challenges can pop up.
Like,
Well, think about the antitrust issues that companies like Microsoft and Google have faced.
right, with great power comes great responsibility or something like that.
Exactly. And the business of platforms does a great job of unpacking these issues. It talks about how Microsoft's dominance with Windows, it led to all sorts of anti-competitive practices.
And for those of us who aren't lawyers, what does antitrust actually mean?
It's basically a way to prevent companies from becoming monopolies. So in Microsoft's case, they were accused of using their power with Windows to give themselves an unfair advantage in other areas.
Oh, I see. So it's like they were using their dominance in one area to control another.
Exactly. And it's not just Microsoft. Google's been under the microscope too, especially with Android.
Yeah, I've heard about that. So what does the future hold for platforms? I mean, we're talking about AI, quantum computing. It's a brave new world out there.
It is. And the business of platforms doesn't shy away from tackling those big questions. It paints a picture of a future where platforms are even more integrated into our lives.
Like, in what way?
Well, take AI, for example. It's already being used to personalize our experiences online, right? But imagine a world where AI-powered platforms are managing entire industries.
AI running the show. That's both exciting and a little terrifying at the same time.
It definitely raises some big questions, and that's what I appreciate about this book. It doesn't just celebrate the success of platforms, it also makes us confront the challenges. It leaves us with a powerful message. As we move into this future, we have to make sure that innovation doesn't come at the expense of our values.
It's about building a better future for everyone, not just for the platforms themselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about what makes platforms tick, why some succeed while others fail.
And we've really only scratched the surface. The business of platforms, it goes into so much more detail, and there's just a wealth of information there for anyone who really wants to understand this stuff.
It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the future of, well, pretty much everything. A big thank you to our expert for this incredible deep dive, and to all of you for listening. We'll see you next time.